Hello and welcome to another edition of Truth and Rhythm, brought to you by funkinstuff.net. This is the interview show that gets deep into the pocket with contemporary music's foremost masters of the groove. Available in video format at funkinstuff.net and on YouTube. Truth and Rhythm can now also be enjoyed on the go as audio podcast edition from funkinstuff.net, iTunes, and other leading providers. I'm your host, Scott Dr. Scott Goldfine, musicologist and author of Everything is on the One, the First Guide to Funk. Get your copy if you don't have it yet. Whether you're watching or listening, as always, I thank you very much for your continued interest and support. You have to bear with me a little on today's show because I do have a cold, as you know, regular viewers can probably tell from my voice. But funk soldiers gotta push on, so I'll keep at it. Especially because my guest today is keyboardist, trumpet player, composer, and producer Gerry Thomas, a central figure with not one, but two of the most prominent funk R&B bands of the 1970s. I'm talking about the Fatback Band and the Jimmy Castor Bunch. Gerry recorded some 30 albums between the two, about 20 of them for Fatback that extended well into the 1980s. That group, which was founded by drummer Bill Curtis, released many funkified tracks with some favorites including Are You Ready? Do the Bus Stop? Do the Spanish Hustle, I Like Girls, Got to Get My Hands on Some Money, Backstroking, King Tim III, Personality Jock, Freak the Funk, Let's Do It Again, and Hip So Slick. The biggest hits, or I should say the biggest hit there was Backstroking, which went to number 3 on the US R&B chart in 1980. The Jimmy Castor Bunch's danceable delights included Troglodyte, Caveman, which was a top 10 U.S. pop crossover hit in 1972. Also Luther the Anthropoid, Anthropoid, Ape Man, The Birth of Butt Boogie, King Kong, Super Sound, and Space Age. Thanks to those early 1970s hits, the first of which I heard in grade school, I was familiar with the Jimmy Castor Bunch from an earlier age, but thanks to I Like Girls, I became a much bigger Fatback fan. Although Castor was a talented multi-instrumentalist, they always seemed a bit more like a novelty act to me, whereas Fatback was more of a straight-up funk and R&B band. But you know, behind the Castor Bunch was amazing musicians. Heavily influenced by the horn-driven syncopations of James Brown and the JBs, Fatback Band albums were parties and wax, with festive songs setting just about anyone within earshot in motion, grooving to the funk, soul, Latin, disco, New Orleans, and reggae rhythms. While the Fatback Band, for the most part, ended its prolific run of producing studio albums in the late 1980s, a version of the group continues to perform. With that, let's find out how all of that wonderful music came to be with one of the primary parties responsible for it, Mr. Gerry Thomas. So with that, Gerry, I turn the camera on you and say, how you doing?
How you doing, Doc? I'm sorry to hear you got a cold. You're not supposed to get a cold on the West Coast.
Well, no, I'm actually in the Carolinas now.
Oh, are you? Oh, well, no wonder then. Get ready for me.
Yeah. So, but you're up the coast a bit, right? So where are you right now?
Washington, in Virginia, actually, in Manassas, a home of Bull Run from the Civil War. So, yeah, I'm originally from the Bronx, New York. Came down here. We used to play down in Washington a lot when I was with Jimmy, and I always had an affinity for the city. Back then, it was called Chocolate City, for a lot of obvious reasons that your listeners probably know. But Washington was always a fun town. As a matter of fact, I like hanging out in Washington more than I did in New York.
Yeah, well, I came out to the East Coast about 10 years ago from Los Angeles, as you said. And I've just been having a blast, you know, checking out up and down the coast. There's so much history, so many great things to see. And D.C. was such a thrill to go to for the first time about 4 years ago with my son. Amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're all good. Had a bit of a hiccup, but now you're right as rain and back to it, right?
Yeah, back to work.
Very cool. We love that. We love that. All right. So you ready to dig into some questions and
Sure.
give up the funk today?
Yep, definitely. Want to keep the funk alive.
Absolutely. That's what it's all about. So, Gerry, let's start way back. with your roots in music. You know, tell us about your upbringing and how music became central in your life, and how you got exposure to not only the keyboards but also trumpet playing and your other you know, studio and stage talents.
Well, I guess like a lot of kids of my generation, uh, there was a piano in the house. My mother used to play piano by ear. She was not formally taught. And my aunt had an upright piano. So my mother decided I should take piano lessons, whether I wanted to or not. But anyway, I was about 4.5. So I did take piano lessons for about 4 years until I just got tired of watching all my friends go out and play football and baseball and all the rest. And so I stopped. But probably maybe about the time that I was 11 or so, I would hear songs on the radio that I got curious about, and I would go to the piano and try to pluck out the melody and different things. So there was a musical ear there. And my mother used to tell me that when I was a toddler, because we had 78s back then, you know, those big records that look like albums that are very brittle.
Like dinner plates, yeah.
That I would go pick out the records I liked and put them on the record player and play them. I could only assume I'd do that because I'd recognize the color of the label, because I certainly couldn't read back then. But there was a music affinity. And when I got to junior high school, fortunately, they had a music program at the school I went to. It was Herman Ritter in the Bronx. And so I decided to try the trumpet. Now, like we had discussed earlier before we went on the air, I wanted to play guitar because my uncle played guitar. So I liked the guitar, but they didn't offer guitar. So I had to pick an instrument. So I'm looking at all the instruments. I said, saxophone, too many keys; flute, too many keys; clarinet, too many keys. Trumpet's only got 3 valves, you know, because I didn't want to do the trombone because that kind of, you know, had no stops. You just slide, you know. So I picked the trumpet. Boy, was that a mistake. But I did turn out to be a pretty good trumpet player. I put my neighbors through a lot when I first had to learn that thing, because obviously when if you're playing a trumpet, they didn't have those silent mute systems that Yamaha puts out now. You could hear me for blocks. So, you know, that first year was torturous. They didn't put us out of the building, but I used to get some stares when I used to walk by with my trumpet. And then I went to, originally I wanted to go to Bronx High School of Science. In New York, they had specialized high schools. They still do, but back then they had 5 specialized high schools. It was Bronx High School of Science, Music and Art, Performing Arts, which was the Fame School from the TV series of the 70s, and then Brooklyn Tech for people who wanted to do engineering and types of things. So originally I wanted to go to Bronx High School of Science, and I did test for it. But before that, I kind of discovered that I really liked music. And I had a really hip trumpet teacher who was one of my teachers in junior high school, played trombone. Jack Gerard was his name. And so I went and I auditioned for Music and Art, and I got in there. And it was an interesting experience, because at that time, Music and Art was in Harlem. It was up by City College, and it was up on this hill, looked like a castle, you know. And a lot of different people went to that school from all different kind of cultures, very diverse culturally. But it was the sister school to Performing Arts. Performing Arts basically did with dance, theater, and art, painting, things like that. Music and Art dealt more with, it did the art, but it had the musical side of it. So a lot of classical influences. But by that time, I had also developed some strong leanings towards jazz. My favorite band has always been the Count Basie Band. And I like Duke for his musicality, the tonal things that he did. So because I've always liked the composing side of things. And when you study the piano, it's always been said the piano is like the orchestra because it's got the complete range of all the instruments. So the studying orchestration and how to compose, arrange, and things like that would give you you could use the tones and the colors, and I always liked that. However, my favorite trumpet player was Dizzy Gillespie, and if you'll notice, this says Diz and Bird. So, so I like Dizzy, and because I liked his personality as well as his playing. So he was my favorite trumpet player, and then from there I expanded into other trumpet players that I like. Miles, Clifford Brown. I love Clifford Brown, and then Freddie Hubbard and different people. But anyway, so that gave me that background, and like I said, I was pretty good in music. Some of the people that went to music and art at the time that I was there was Hugh Masekela's daughter, Hugh, and Miriam Makeba. They had a daughter, Angie Makeba, and Josh White's daughter, Judy White. She was there. So there were a lot of people who had solid backgrounds, and there are people who've come out of that school that have gone on to great success in the arts. But once I got out of there, I then went to Manhattan School of Music for a semester and was offered a partial scholarship at a small college, music college, but it was called New York College of Music. It was on the east side of Upper Manhattan. And that was an interesting experience. I got to meet Kenny Dorham, who I had met earlier in my career on a New York City subway car. I was going to a rehearsal or something, and he was riding the car, and I saw him, and he had a trumpet, and we just started talking. So it was interesting when he wound up coming to the school. Harold Mayburn was another one that went there, and I forget, there was a saxophonist that went there too. So there were some established jazz musicians who were going there to get more training on the formal side of the music. So one of the things you learn is that musicians always want to keep learning and exploring. And if you stop exploring or trying to learn, you really get stagnant. And you'll hear that consistently from musicians who are really into what they do. But anyway, coming out of that period in New York, there used to be, this is before disco. So what used to happen was a lot of times people would give dances on the weekend, and bands would play at these different functions. So they were basically like your DJs, right? They played the live music, people would dance at these dances or parties, whatever you want to call them. And there was a group that was led by Ron Anderson. It was called Ron Anderson and the Versatiles. The drummer in that group was Bill Curtis at the time, and that's how I met Bill. And Bill told me around, I guess this was 68, early 69, that he had the nucleus of Fatback, but he was doing local bands, so he was booking for dancers as well. But he hadn't started recording yet. And he had told me that he was going to start to do something, and he wanted me to help him with it. So I said, sure, anytime you want to do it. So he had actually released his first album, which I think was People Music. And when he was getting ready for the second album, that's when I came in and started working with him. And I worked with him all the way up until I formally stopped performing live. But at that same time, I also met, in New York, they used to have what they used to call these jazz festivals that were sponsored by the New York, the American Federation of Musicians, the local 802 in New York. Jazzmobile is what they called. I think Billy Taylor started that way back in the early 60s. And what they would do is they'd have this big truck. It was like a stage, and they'd perform in different neighborhoods, and people would come to hear them. And mostly it was mostly jazz, but in doing that, I'd meet different musicians, would expand my field of of contacts. That was a way of networking. So I met Jimmy Castor's bass player at the time, who was Roland Martinez, and he introduced. So it happened to be that Ron Anderson. We were playing a dance at the Audubon Ballroom, and Jimmy was playing a dance at the Audubon Ballroom in a different room. So in talking with Roland introduced me to Jimmy. And so that's how I got my introduction to Jimmy. And shortly thereafter, Jimmy asked me if I wanted to, join the group. And that was before it actually became the Jimmy Castor Bunch. There were some personnel changes. Other people came in, and the Jimmy Castor Bunch then basically formed roughly about 1970, 71. And that's when we came out with the record "It's Just Begun," which they used in the movie Flashdance. That came much later, but that's when that song was recorded, and Troglodyte, which you mentioned, which kind of took Jimmy into that novelty bag. We weren't really a novelty group, but because that record was the gold record, you always try to repeat the success that you have. So we kind of got stuck in that vein, but we had a lot of fun with that.
Well, let me jump in there. That's a lot of history. So, Gerry, I actually have here, according to what I have, that Let's Do It Again was the first Fatback. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And then People Music actually
helped them with.
Yeah. So, so when that Jimmy Castor single hit like it did, why do you think it was such a sensation? And how did that affect you and that group?
Well, that's kind of an interesting story because Jimmy used to like to watch movies late at night, and he happened to be watching this movie. It was called Troglodyte, and it was Joan Crawford was in the movie. Imagine Joan Crawford in a movie about cavemen. But anyway, so he came to us. We were working at Small's Paradise in Harlem, and he said, "When I saw this movie, I got this idea for the song." He said, "Give me some kind of jungle music or something," So we came up with the rhythm, because it's just a one groove continually through the record. There are no changes or anything else in it. So we did that, and he would start rapping, and the people at Smalls would start cracking up. They thought it was a funny record. So when we were recording that first album at RCA, Jimmy's manager at the time, Danny Lewis, said, "Put that record on there. Put it on the album. Let's put it on there." We all said, "We don't want to. No, that's a novelty record. No, go ahead." So we put it on there, and boom, it wound up being a big hit.
Well, what was it like when you first heard it on the radio and you saw what it was becoming?
It was kind of amazing. If you've seen the movie The Five Heartbeats.
Yeah.
Okay.
Robert Townsend.
Right. When you, which I think is a great movie. I love that movie. But if you remember the scene when he hears the record on the radio, it's exactly the same type of thing. You say, "Oh, wow, they're playing my record," So you get excited about it. You don't think you're getting stuck in that, because on that first album, I mean, we did all kinds of different musical styles on that record, but just that's what people had the affinity for, and that's what he kind of got labeled with.
Yeah, to me, I think it's kind of if you don't know going in and you put on that record, the whole album, it's kind of surprising, because a lot of the other stuff is so much more complex and so deep musically. Great keyboards, guitar work, all of it. And actually, I think maybe a lot of people don't realize what a talent Jimmy Castor was. So could you speak about his musicality a little bit?
Oh yeah, he actually went to music and art too. The funny thing about Jimmy would never tell you his age. So he used to tell me, he said, "I went to music and art," and I said, "When did you go?" Because I didn't remember seeing it, because they'd have pictures of students, from previous class year. And so it never lined up with what he would tell you was his age, but anyway. But Jimmy, the thing I liked about Jimmy, because Jimmy could knew that I like to do arranging and orchestrations and things like that. And he always gave me the freedom to kind of expand the things that we were doing. So he would be very open. Matter of fact, It's Just Begun came out of a song that I had done. It was completely different. It had the basic motif of It's Just Begun, dun, 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 dun. And he and his partner John Pruitt were actually at my house, my mother's house, and they would listen to it and they say, well, let's change this and let's change that and let's do this and this. And that's how It's Just Begun came about. He also let me do the prologue and epilogue creation, which was kind of different for a so-called R&B group, But I liked the Beatles. I loved Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. So you hear some of those types of influence. My Brightest Day is kind of like a tribute to Blood, Sweat, and Tears in Chicago, the types of things that they were doing with the horns and changing tempos and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't your standard type of album, so which kind of made it kind of difficult, especially back in those days, for how do we market these people, I loved it musically, but it did make it a little difficult. So I think when Troglodyte hit, it made it easier for them to say, okay, let's go in this direction.
So explain to me, Gerry, the differences in working with a Jimmy Castor in the studio and creating with that band and what it was like with Bill and creating in the Fatback Band.
Polar opposites. We would, for the most part, most of the musicians in the bunch at that time were trained musicians. Not to say the guys in in Bill's group weren't, but in Jimmy's group, we would rehearse. I'd write out charts a lot of times. And so when we went into the studio, everything was already basically pre-planned. That didn't mean that you couldn't come up with an idea that might change something. But that's basically how we went in. So it was more structured. I would have sometimes strings on the sessions. Obviously you're not going to improvise with that because it'd take too long to write up the charts, while you're in the studio and that clock is running. So all of that, most of that stuff was pre-planned. Bill, when you went to the studio, you didn't know what the heck you were going to do. So it's basically, okay, let's play a groove. What you got, Flip? What you got, Johnny? It was that type of thing. So it was much freer in terms of creativity, but you didn't know where you were going. But that freedom allowed you to listen more, and then pick up on what somebody was doing. You could say, hey, why don't we try this? Let's try this. But the sessions would be, super long sometimes. And the other thing that Bill liked is he always liked having that party atmosphere. So we'd have people in the studio who just saying, okay, just party. And so you'd hear on those early albums, background noise, people partying. That was live. That was live. Some of it drove the
fun.
It was live, yeah.
Were you recording in the same studios or different studios?
No, we had different studios. The early Cast albums were done at RCA Studios. While we were with RCA, when we went to Atlantic, then we would kind of venture out. We did several of those at Media Sound in New York, and that was partially because I think Bill, the Fatback, was starting to use that as well. So we already had a relationship there, and we knew the engineers. Tony Bon Jovi, who was a legend in recording from the work he had done at Motown, had opened up the studio, Media Sound, which was actually an old church that they converted into a recording studio. And a lot of your top engineers came out of that place. Bob Clearmountain, Michael Barbieri, Godfrey Diamond. So they all were assistants basically when we were there. except for Tony, you know, and we were using Tony. And one of the funny stories was because Bill didn't always know the technical jargon, so he kind of say, "Well, I want this. You'll give me this." And Tony would just look at him and say, you know. And then he said, "Gerry, what does he want?" And I said, "This is what I want." You know. And if I was on the road with Jimmy and Bill had booked the studio, you know, Tony would say, "Gerry, you got to come back."
Interpreter, right?
Exactly. You know?
So did Bill have any formal training, or was he pretty much self-taught?
No, he had some formal training in percussion and stuff, and then when he was in the Army, he also played in the Army band while he was in the service in the earlier 50s. And then you know, I know he worked with Bill Doggett and a couple other people, you know, when he got out.
So when you first connected with each band, Gerry, you know, Jimmy had already had an album out. Fatback already had an album out. You know, what did you think of what they have been doing, and what did you think you could bring to that, and what were maybe they looking for you to bring to it?
Well, the funny thing was Jimmy's first hit, quote unquote, and it was, like I said, it wasn't the bunch then, it was just Jimmy Castor, was Hey Leroy, which was kind of a novelty record. You know, it was a calypso, but it was still a novelty. You know, "Hey Leroy, what? Your mother, she's calling you." You know, and it goes into that. So I guess there was some seeds to what was to come later there. But basically, I mean, we were basically a cover band. A lot of the stuff we did, we used to cover, you know, the music of the time that we enjoyed. As it became the bunch, the original stuff started coming together, and I think that gave Jimmy a vehicle with the musicians he had to be able to concentrate a little bit more on the writing that he wanted to do. In terms of Bill, Bill had these sounds and ideas in his head, but he didn't write anything down. He'd just go into the studio and say, he might hum a phrase to you or say, play something, and then go from there. He was more like George Clinton in that, you know, because Bernie Worrell and I were good friends. So we used to talk a lot about, you know, the different situations, because I had a lot of respect for Bernie. I thought he was one of the great keyboard players, you know. Sorry that, you know, to hear about his passing recently, but Bernie was cool, and it did influence us. I like the girls was more going P-Funk than James Brown. You know, that was the groove, because you'll hear a lot of the synth work kind of imitate some of the stuff that Bernie was doing with the Moog, you know, because like I said, he influenced a lot of what I did with them, with Fatback. But so getting back to Bill, when I joined the group, he didn't bring me in. He brought me in basically to help him with the recording stuff, because I was still working with Jimmy, so it was only the recording stuff that I would come in there. But I think he had ideas of wanting to expand things, so he would let me add little things, because I used to bring them stuff they wouldn't have never thought about doing on their own. The structure, how they created, wasn't into that, but the guys were musical, you know, so it interests them, and then it was challenging. They wanted to do it, you know. The arrangement I did on December '63, "Oh What a Night," was very complex, because all of that had to be taught, because none of it was written out, and there are a lot of different changes in that particular arrangement. So we had to go by section, and you know, they kept up with it and did it. So it was, I enjoyed it because it gave me a chance to broaden the things that I was doing. I could do things with them that we weren't doing on Jimmy's side, and vice versa.
And that was from the Night Fever 1976 album. Oh, What a Night. Yeah. So viewers know. What made you decide to cover that particular song?
It just interests me, you know. It was, I liked the tune. I said, let me That might be an interesting tune for us to do. You know, something totally different. I don't think anybody would have expected, you know, Fatback to do that particular tune. You know, so and they didn't.
So I got to ask you, you know, did Jimmy or Bill care that you were, you know, in the others' camp, and you know, was there ever any conflicts or issues with that? I mean, how did you keep everybody happy?
I've always been diplomatic. Well, because the producing, the arranging that I was doing didn't encroach on either area. Because even though Jimmy, some of the stuff we did was funky, more of our stuff would be, I would consider, maybe pop R&B on Jimmy's side. So there wasn't any. There only became an issue once that I'll briefly talk about. That there was when I wrote Spanish Hustle. I originally wrote it for Jimmy, and there was a situation that happened within the group that strained our relationship. And so when I had taught it to the band, and matter of fact, we were working out at Disneyland, and on one of their stages, and they had the submerged stage, and then it brings you up. So what the guys would do is we would jam on Spanish Hustle as it was bringing the stage up, and then stop, right? But it seemed like a natural tune because Jimmy played timbales and all of that and stuff. Well, like I said, our relationship got a little strange. So when I mentioned to him, you know, about the song, he said, "Oh, I can give that to Lenny Adams," because Lenny Adams had Black Ivory at the time. I'm trying to say, Lenny Adams. I said, "Okay, never mind. Don't worry about it." And I taught it to Fatback, and I knew Vince Aletti at I think he was at Record World, and Tom Moulton. You know, and like we got dubs to them, and they said, "Wow," you know, and they got it to the clubs and kind of broke it, you know. So while that record was going up the charts, you know, I used to get some looks sometimes, you know.
I bet, because it's not only that you changed it, but also was it kind of a hit. So
yeah. Wasn't changed that much, and I think the other part of it to say it would have been an instrumental record for Jimmy, because obviously the synthesizer was playing the lead, which for Fatback wasn't a problem, because Fatback really wasn't a singing group until much later. I mean, people sang, but they weren't singers, you know what I'm saying? We didn't really have that till we had Michael Walker, who came later.
Group vocals.
Yeah. So there wouldn't have been much for Jimmy to do except play timbales, because you couldn't have played that. You could have played it on saxophone, but it wasn't really written that way. You know what I'm saying? So I'll say maybe that's why he thought of giving it to somebody else. But I wasn't interested in doing that. So I said, if we're not going to do it, then I'll give it to Fatback, and we can do that.
So obviously fences were mended because you continued working in that arrangement for years after that.
Oh yeah. That was a little hiccup.
For the diplomatic Gerry Thomas.
Well, it got towards the latter part of the 70s. Jimmy wasn't really getting hits anymore. So when I had to do studio work with Fatback, that started to get strained, and that really caused more of the break, because, you know, my income was coming more from that side than it was coming from Jimmy's side. So that accelerated me leaving the group, you know. I mean, just for economic sense, you know.
What year did you part from Jimmy Castor?
79.
79,
yeah.
So Fatback Band, the name, I've heard that it's related to the New Orleans, Fatback, but did it also have double meanings, for ladies' hindquarters and money and all that stuff? What's behind the name?
Bill always told me that there was a beat in out of the New Orleans area that emphasized the bass drum and the snare, but the bass drum really prominent, and that's what he called the Fatback beat. It was there's a funny story about when we had our gold record on Hotbox, and the record company was going to do a party, and they told us they were going to have Fatback as part of the food items. We said no, don't go there. That's not what Fatback means. So don't go there.
Yeah, I would think there was a lot of that probably that people weren't familiar with, the origin.
Yeah.
So, I think I didn't mention when we were talking about, but that troglodyte, I mean, that whole thing, I think, was a big influence on some of the stuff that Kool and the Gang would do. Do you agree with that? Like,
yeah,
Jungle Boogie, Spare the Boogie, that kind of stuff.
Right. And we used to do a lot of gigs together. I mean, I knew the guys. Sometimes we'd hang out afterwards. They were from Jersey, we from the Bronx and Queens and Brooklyn. So we knew each other. So we were listening to what each other were doing. There were a lot of bands coming out of New York at that time. Mandrill, Brass Construction, So we were all listening to each other. So yeah, I can imagine. I don't know if they would say that influenced them, but I think it did. I think it did.
Yeah. Well, hey, it worked. Those were big hits for them too. So.
Oh yeah, no question.
So, what was it like? Did you get out and do any live performances with Fatback? Did you do live performances with Jimmy Castor, whether in a venue or TV appearances?
Yeah. Well, like I said, with Jimmy, when I joined the group, he was a touring band. A lot of that we did was what would used to be called the Chitlin circuit. I mean, we went all up and down the East Coast, out to the West Coast. Canada, went up to Canada a lot, to Toronto, and would play. There was a club up there called Le Coq d'Or that we used to play on a regular basis. Small's Paradise, the Apollo, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. We would do some concerts. They had I think it was the last album we did with RCA. They had this big concert in Atlanta as a tribute to Martin Luther King, and we were there for that. So yeah, we did a lot of traveling. I went to Saudi Arabia with Jimmy. We went to England. There was a tour that Atlantic put together in '75 with the Spinners, Sister Sledge, Benny King, and us. That's how I met Benny, who we were lifelong friends after that. Matter of fact, he did a guest appearance on the last album we did with Fatback at Cotillion back in '83. But it was funny because when we went over to England, the first city we played was Liverpool, home of the Beatles, right? So after we did the show, we went out and hung out at a discotheque, right? And what are they playing but some Fatback? So when I told some people, I said, oh yeah, I did some work with them. They were coming over to me more behind the Fatback than the fact that I was over there with Jimmy.
What year was that?
That was in '75. So Bill hadn't been over there. So when I got back, I told her, I said, you got to get in touch with the promoter and get over to England because you guys are hot up there, you know. Especially the Northern Soul, if you're familiar with any of the stuff over in Europe, in England especially, they played a lot of soul music because the BBC didn't play any of that stuff at that time. That later changed because a lot of the offshore pirate radio stations and what was coming out of the North, because that they would play all the stuff that the BBC wouldn't play. That was really the funky music, you know. The funk music and R&B. So that's when he started going over there, and they found out they were very popular and did very well over there, you know. And when I went over a number of times once I switched over, but all through the 70s, I only appeared with Jimmy, and I would work in the studios with Fatback.
So, Gerry, what was the stage presentation like for each act during the 70s? You know, how did they differ there?
Well, after once Jimmy got into more the novelty bag, there would be a lot of presentations. So like when we had Dracula, King Kong, and all those novelty records, we actually had either stage people or one of the roadies would get up in a Kong suit to come out like King Kong, and the bass player would dress up like Dracula. So that became a big part of the stick of the show. But other than that, I mean, it was basically Jimmy as the front man and we're the band, you know. Whereas Fatback, it was just kind of straight across. It was like a lot of the bands back in those days, Kool and the Gang and a lot of those groups, you didn't really have the front man. I forget the lead that was with Kool. That when they had Celebration and
JT Taylor,
right? That became more of the standard. You know, you got the front man and then you got the guys behind it. But so we were bands, BT Express, all of those groups at that time. You know, so it was almost like just an evolution of what used to be the dance bands back in the day, you know, when we used to do parties and dances. You know, you were just playing music for dances. So that was, like I said before, that was the precursor to disco. You know, we didn't know that we were going to create a situation that would lead to our own demise in terms of places to work. But anyway, you know, then you had to find big venues. You have to get records that were big enough because no club wanted to hire you at the cost that might cost them to bring in 8, 9 people when he could pay one DJ to come in and play some records, you know. So, so that kind of changed the business from that standpoint. But one of the things, because we knew we didn't have, and this is a Fatback, that we didn't have a real front man, because Johnny Flippin played bass, so he couldn't stop playing bass and just sing. He had to sing and play bass. So that kind of limited it to some degree. So we got dancers that we wound up calling Wild Sugar, that would perform with the group to give you some more showmanship on the stage. You know, you're not just looking at guys playing. You know, you actually had some performers. So some attractive young ladies that you could look at, you know, dancing. So that added element, you know.
Yeah, a lot of the bands back then would do that, either get some eye candy up there or get some dancers up there.
And they would do some of the background singing too, you know. But they were hired originally because actually Robin Dunn, who was with the group back at that time, has done a lot of work with a lot of hip hop acts and stuff in terms of choreography and stuff that she's done later. So she's very popular up in New York, post Fatback. But they were hired basically for the dancing and the singing later, you know. And then we kind of had to try to. It was way before auto-tune and all the rest of that stuff.
Right.
I'll put it that way. Though Deborah Cooper was with us in those early days, and then she later went and became a part of Change. So she's had a good career.
So, Gerry, how did you manage to be so prolific? I mean, some of those years were 3 records coming out between the 2 bands. It must have been you were working all the time, or just fast, or what?
A little bit of everything. Like I said, with Jimmy, we didn't quite put out records at the same speed as Fatback, and because they were, in other words, I would present songs that I thought he might be interested to him for approval. It was more structured, more organized, and then he would decide, okay, we're going to use this, and this for the album. Whereas with Fatback, it was more open. Like I said, sometimes sessions, we'd be in the studio all day and all night. We didn't know what time of day or night it was, and which was very costly, but it led to some very interesting sessions and situations, because it really gave us a chance to spend more time to experiment and get what we were looking for. Jimmy liked to work faster. Sometimes I think he liked to work a little too fast. He wasn't into doing 10 or 20 takes. He'd do a couple of takes and that was it. So I think for him, sometimes we let things go that we shouldn't have. You know what I'm saying? And this is before digital and all the rest of that stuff. So, if you wanted to splice things, you had to splice them. There was no digital slicing where you could just insert. This wasn't before auto tunes a lot. Some of that stuff.
Razor blades.
Correct. And we've had some experiences with that. When messed up, because when you're cutting 24 track. You make a mistake, it's over. You can't recoup, especially when you get into those thin slices, where you're trying to shave a beat or something, So most of the times we try to do that to the 2 track and then do it. But occasionally we had a couple of situations with the bigger ones, which led to some interesting effects. There's a record we had out called "The Girl Is Fine." I think that was on the Is This the Future album, which was the last record we did with Spring. And if you notice, it's got a very weird, very beginning. It's almost like you hear the drums lurch into it. Well, that's because we started recording before the engineer actually pushed the button. So while he pushed the button, it actually caught, So you're hearing it speed up to speed. We didn't start record, then start playing, Anyway. But we like the fact that it did that. One of the things that when you're creating, you learn what they say. You have to have a hook. The hook could be something melodic, could be a lyric, could be a sound, but something that you would remember. Those were the things that you always tried to look for when you were creating things.
So looking back at some of the earlier Fatback albums. You had a female singer that became prominent around 74 period, it looks like. How did that happen? And, did you have a preference if there was, prominent lead vocalist versus a group vocal? And where'd you sit on that?
Oh, no. Whoever could do the song, justice, basically, is what we would look for. Some of the songs, especially the ones that I wrote, I would have a particular, because by that time I knew the sound. I knew Johnny King's sound. I knew Flip's sound. So I would already have in mind who I'd ask, can you sing this song? Can you sing this part or whatever? And a lot of the songs would have group vocal and then lead, sections. So it didn't matter, whoever could do the song, we would allow to do that, and a lot of guest appearances with different people. Matter of fact, on the Night Fever album, on the song Night Fever, you hear a female vocal on the bridge that's just saying Night Fever. That was Phyllis Hyman.
Huh?
Yeah. That was an uncredited spot we did. But when Phyllis first came to New York, she used to perform a lot at a club called McKell's up in Upper Manhattan on the west side. And we got to be really good friends. So I would come down to Washington when she was playing in Washington and just hang out with her and her husband, Larry, at the time. And because I mean, I just thought she was fantastic. She had a fantastic voice. So we didn't communicate as much after she was in the hit play and later on. And obviously she tragically died, but she was a great talent. So I asked her would she come in and do that for me, and she said yeah, she had no problem. So, but we had a lot of things. We used a lot of people guest appeared on some of our records. David Sanborn was on some of the things we did. Who else? One of the person that I went to school with, keyboard, jazz pianist, Najee Allen Gums, has done several guest appearances on some of the albums that we've done. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned about the sort of influence and, sharing and, being colleagues and friends with some of the other bands like Kool and the Gang back then, and going back and listening to the early records, I hear so many influences and, hopefully you agree, but I mean, I hear, Temptations and Just Be a Truth, some Funkadelics and Beat the Express. Of course, James Brown was big, even some Sly Stone. How are all those things influencing and inspiring the band, and how did you try to, take that in without just, mimicking or copying it?
Well, I mean, obviously, when you're listening to music, and depending on how broad your musical interests and tastes are, you absorb a lot of that stuff. So you tend to build on what's come before you. So you hear things that you like. One of the things that I tried to do was not. I mean, I might copy the flavor. Like I said, I Like Girls was influenced by P-Funk, Funkadelic. But you didn't want to totally abrogate their sound, their style, where you're just copying them. Influencing is one thing, but actually taking it, was another, which sampling got into that area. I think that's always been the case, with the history of music. Everybody listens to who's come before them and then take little things that you hear and then twist it and change it and look at it from a different point of view and give it your own personality and style. We didn't, maybe the closest that I came to copying a style, like I mentioned earlier, was My Brightest Day on the first album that was under the Jimmy Castor Bunch name, which was a tribute more or less to Blood, Sweat, and Tears and Chicago. It wasn't us trying to be them, it was just saying, oh, we admire this group, so this is like what they might do, Obviously we didn't have the brass section of either group, so it wasn't going to be that big, but it would, if you listen to it, you say, oh yeah, okay, I can hear the influence, it was that type of thing. So, and I think you hear that in a lot of groups, a lot of groups, you hear in some of the stuff Prince did, he's acknowledging the people that came before him, and the sounds that came before him, and people after him acknowledge that, oh yeah, we're influenced by Prince. Sly and the Family Stone, we used to play a lot of their songs with Jimmy, so that naturally that becomes an influence, we weren't trying to be Sly and the Family Stone, but you might get a Sly and the Stone type of a groove or flavor, but we didn't have Larry Graham, we didn't have, Rose, we didn't have So everybody's going to do their own interpretation of.
Well, I think there can be a thin line between, you know, sort of mimicking or replicating and assimilating it and creating something new with it.
Correct. You know, and a lot of times when you're trying to, I'll give you an example. You have the what they call the cover bands, right? Where they actually try to sound like the record, note for note, vocal inflections, everything. You know, that's a whole different thing. You know, that's not being creative. That's just imitating. You know, and that's not to say the people that do that don't have creativity, but their creativity, at least as demonstrated in those situations, is based on something that came before them. They didn't do that. They're just imitating it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
Jerry, this song, Do the Bus Stop, was a hit in '75. That was a dance of some kind, right? What was going on behind that? And was it sort of a craze in the East Coast?
I believe the bus stop was a dance that started out of Chicago.
Chicago.
Yeah, and Bill was familiar with it. Robin was familiar with it. So he wanted to do something that would, it was a line dance, you know, and there have been many different variations of line dances, you know. So that was what he was trying to capitalize on. Let's do our version of a song that people can do the bus stop to, you know, and then teach them how to do the bus stop at the same time in the song. So that's where that came from. That was his whole focus when we did that.
And that same record had the Spanish hustle on it. How did you come by sort of some of that Spanish or Latin influence in what you did? Was it just part of being in the New York area?
Totally. I grew up in the South Bronx. There's a Hispanic area at that time and continues to be. There were some clubs over on Southern Boulevard where they used to have Willie Colon. Can't think of the names now, but a lot of the major talents of the area would perform there. I always liked Latin music, Afro-Cuban. All of that is related. I like the rhythms. One of the instruments that I played when I was going to school was it's like the French, I think it was a mellophonium. But anyway, but when you're playing that, a lot of the parts that were written for it was syncopated. So it helped develop that sense of being able to play off rhythm, you know. So I still like and listen to a lot of Latin music, you know. So yeah, it was definitely New York influenced from the area that I grew up in. Yeah.